The bulldozer's engine roar woke James Sullivan at 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The 42-year-old civil engineer stood on his porch in his boxer shorts and undershirt, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, watching heavy machinery carve a 20-foot-wide path straight through his family's 100-acre cattle ranch. 3 generations of Sullivans had worked this land in rural Colorado, and now some contractor was tearing through the eastern pasture like it was public property. James's hands shook, not from the cold mountain air, but from a rage so pure it felt like ice in his veins. For 6 months, the Ridgemont Heights HOA had been pressuring him to sell his eyesore property. 6 months of certified letters, zoning complaints, and thinly veiled threats. But this morning was different. This morning, they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. And what these suburban warriors in their vinyl-sided fortresses didn't know was that the quiet rancher they'd been, harassing, held both a civil engineering degree and every single property deed going back to 1887. They wanted a shortcut to their precious amenities. James was about to give them an expensive education in property rights. Before we dive into how James turned an HOA's illegal land grab into their worst financial nightmare, if you love stories where entitled people finally meet someone who knows exactly how to fight back, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts: the violation that pushed a reasonable man past his breaking point, the confrontation where a civil engineer dismantled an HOA's arrogance with cold legal precision, and the resolution where every single car paid the price for their board's overreach. The first part reveals the slow burn of harassment that preceded the bulldozer. James Sullivan wasn't just some random rancher. He was a man who'd spent 20 years designing municipal infrastructure, who knew property law better than most attorneys, and who'd been quietly documenting every HOA violation for half a year. The violation wasn't just the road. It was months of entitled suburbanites treating his family's legacy like an obstacle to their convenience. The breaking point came with diesel fumes and the sound of his fence posts being ripped from the ground his grandfather had worked. Something inside James didn't just break, it crystallized into perfect, calculated resolve. The confrontation wasn't a screaming match. It was a civil engineer calmly explaining to an HOA president exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. James had spent 2 weeks after the bulldozer incident doing what he did best: surveying, researching, and planning. When he finally sat across from Patricia Whitmore and her board, he had a 3-inch binder of documentation and a smile that made her nervous. The moment she realized they'd just built an illegal road across private property and that James Sullivan had no intention of letting them forget it, was the moment the power dynamics shifted completely. His ultimatum was simple, expensive, and entirely legal. They could have avoided all of it, but they'd wanted to play hardball with the wrong man. The resolution is where patience became profit and arrogance became a monthly invoice. James didn't just block the road. He didn't just sue. He did something far more elegant and infinitely more painful. Every single car that used that illegal shortcut, and there were dozens daily, would now pay tribute to the Sullivan family ranch. The HOA's attempt to pressure him into selling backfired so spectacularly that their own residents turned on them. Justice wasn't swift. It was slow, methodical, and it compounded interest. Here's exactly how it happened. James Michael Sullivan hadn't planned on staying in Colorado. After graduating from Colorado State University with a civil engineering degree, he'd spent 2 decades in Denver, designing highway systems and municipal projects, making good money, living the corporate life. But when his father suffered a stroke in 2019, James came home to help run the family cattle ranch. What was supposed to be 6 months turned permanent when his father passed away that winter. At 42, James found himself the 4th generation, owner of a 100-acre property that had been in the Sullivan family since 1887. He was a widower. His wife Sarah had died from cancer 3 years earlier, with a 16-year-old daughter, Emma, who'd grown to love ranch life. James was methodical, quiet, more comfortable with blueprints than confrontation. But he was also something the HOA didn't anticipate. Someone who understood infrastructure, property rights, and legal frameworks better than their entire board combined. The trouble started the moment Ridgemont Heights broke ground. The new development sprawled across 500 acres of former farmland on the western edge of James's property. Within months, 200 cookie-cutter homes sprouted up, each one priced at $600,000 and populated by the kind of people who thought rural character meant landscaped front yards. The HOA board took one look at James's cattle ranch, with its weathered barn, grazing pastures, and gravel driveway, and decided it didn't fit their aesthetic vision. The first letter arrived in March, professionally printed on expensive letterhead. HOA President Patricia Whitmore, a former marketing executive who'd retired early on her husband's tech money, wrote that the Sullivan property was negatively impacting property values and included a purchase offer, $200,000 for the entire 100 acres. James laughed and threw it in the recycling. The offer was insulting. The land alone was worth 20 times that amount, but Patricia Whitmore wasn't used to being ignored. The letters escalated. Zoning complaints were filed alleging code violations that didn't exist. The county inspector came out 3 times and found nothing wrong. Anonymous complaints about livestock odor reached the Agricultural Extension Office, complaints that made no sense given prevailing wind patterns. James started keeping copies of everything, filing them in chronological order in a binder he labeled HOA Harassment. His engineering mind cataloged each incident with timestamps and documentation. By September, he had 47 separate contacts, complaints, or letters from Ridgemont Heights HOA. Emma asked him why they hated them so much. James explained that entitled people always hate obstacles they can't control. The real problem was geography. Ridgemont Heights sat 2 miles from the main highway. Their developer had built one entrance road that looped around through county property, a 4-mile drive to reach the shopping center and amenities on the eastern side. James's ranch sat directly between the development and those amenities. If someone could cut straight through Sullivan property, the drive dropped to less than a mile. Residents started complaining at HOA meetings. Why did they have to drive the long way around when there was all that empty land right there? Patricia saw an opportunity. If she could pressure James into selling, or better yet, just granting an easement, she'd be a hero to the community. She tried friendly persuasion first, showing up at his door with a fruit basket and a proposal for a shared access road in exchange for nominal compensation. James asked what nominal meant. She said $5,000. He closed the door, then came December. James was in town picking up Emma from school when his phone exploded with notifications. His ranch hand, Miguel, was calling frantically. James answered to the sound of heavy machinery and Miguel shouting in Spanish. When James finally got him calmed down, the story came out in broken English. A contractor with bulldozers had shown up with official paperwork, claiming they had approval to build a road across the eastern pasture. They'd already torn down 200 feet of fence line. Miguel had tried to stop them, but the contractor showed him a work order signed by the county engineering department. James drove 90 miles per hour back to the ranch, his engineering mind already calculating what had happened. Someone had forged county approval. When he arrived, the contractor was sheepish, but showed James the paperwork. It looked official, county letterhead, seal, signatures. But James recognized immediately it was fake. The permit numbers didn't match county formatting. The signature belonged to a clerk who'd retired in 2018. He took photos of everything and told the contractor to leave. The contractor refused, saying he had a signed contract and had already been paid $50,000. By whom? The contractor hesitated, then admitted, Ridgemont Heights HOA. The violation wasn't just the road. It was the audacity. The assumption that they could simply take what they wanted because James was just one man standing in the way of their convenience. That night, James stood in the torn-up pasture under a sky full of stars and felt something shift inside him. His father had taught him that good fences make good neighbors. But what do you do when your neighbors bulldoze the fence? He walked back to his house, sat down at his computer, and began pulling up property records that went back over a century. If Patricia Whitmore wanted to play games with his land, he'd show her exactly what games looked like when an expert played them. James spent the next 2 weeks doing what civil engineers do best, surveying, documenting, and planning with obsessive precision. He hired a professional surveyor to establish his exact property boundaries and discovered something fascinating. The road the contractor had started wasn't just crossing his property, it was cutting through the original 1887 Sullivan Land Grant, which carried special provisions under Colorado homestead law. More importantly, when James examined the county records for Ridgemont Heights development approval, he found that their official site plan showed the Long Loop Road as the sole access point. There was no approved easement through his property. The HOA hadn't just trespassed. They'd commissioned construction based on forged documents, which elevated this from civil to criminal territory. On December 18th, James walked into the Ridgemont Heights HOA office wearing his best suit and carrying a leather briefcase containing 300 pages of documentation. Patricia Whitmore sat behind her desk looking annoyed at the interruption, flanked by two board members, Robert Chen, a corporate attorney who handled HOA legal matters, and Susan Martinez, the treasurer. James introduced himself politely and set his briefcase on her desk. Patricia rolled her eyes and said they'd already made their final offer. James smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind engineers use when explaining to contractors why their shortcuts won't work, and said he wasn't there to sell. He was there to explain their situation. He pulled out the surveyor's report first, sliding it across the desk. Their road crossed his property at two separate points, totaling 420 feet of trespass. Patricia waved dismissively and said they had county approval. James pulled out the forged permit and his analysis of why it was fraudulent. Robert Chen's face went pale as he examined the documents. James let that sink in, then pulled out his third document, a complete title history showing that James Sullivan owned not just the surface rights, but all subsurface and access rights to his property, with no easements granted to any party since 1887. The road they'd built was entirely illegal. Patricia's composure cracked. She stammered that this was a simple misunderstanding, that they'd relied on their contractor's assurances. James nodded sympathetically and said he understood mistakes happen. Then he laid out exactly who she'd been harassing for 6 months. He recited his credentials: 22 years as a licensed civil engineer, specialist in municipal infrastructure, consultant on 3 major Colorado highway projects. He'd designed systems for entire cities. Did she really think he wouldn't know how to protect 100 acres of ranch land? Susan Martinez tried to salvage the situation, suggesting they could simply close the road and restore his fence. James agreed that would be step 1. But there were other steps. He pulled out his final documents, the 47 incidents of harassment, documented and time-stamped. The fraudulent zoning complaints, the forged county permit, the property damage from the bulldozer. James had calculated the total damages at $180,000. Fencing, land restoration, surveyor fees, legal costs, and compensation for emotional distress. Robert Chen started to argue that no court would award that much. James corrected him gently. He wasn't interested in court. Courts were slow and expensive. He had a different proposal. The road was already built. Closing it would cost the HOA money and infuriate their residents who'd already started using the shortcut. So James would allow it to remain as a private toll road across his property. He'd install a gate at each entrance. Every vehicle would pay a fee. The rate would be $15 per passage. Given that approximately 40 to 60 cars per day had been using the route based on his surveillance footage, that would generate between $600 and $900 daily. James would collect the tolls for a minimum of 2 years. After that, they could renegotiate. The total would more than cover his damages. Patricia exploded. This was extortion. James explained patiently that extortion was illegal coercion. This was a private property owner charging fair market rates for access easement across his land. She could either accept his terms, or he'd file criminal charges for the forged permit, sue for damages and trespass, and ensure the story reached every news outlet in Colorado. Robert Chen did the math quickly. The tolls would cost roughly $400,000 over 2 years, but defending the lawsuits could cost twice that, plus the criminal implications. He advised acceptance. Patricia demanded to know how they'd explain this to residents. James smiled again. That was their problem. They'd created this situation by building an illegal road to avoid telling residents the truth, that their development was poorly planned and inconveniently located. Now they could either pay his toll or admit their mistake. The choice was theirs, but they had 24 hours to decide. He closed his briefcase, stood up, and walked out while Patricia Whitmore sat speechless, finally understanding she'd tried to bully someone who'd spent 2 decades outthinking people far more powerful than her. The gate went up on January 5th. James hired a contractor to install 2 automated entrance gates, one at each end of the road where it crossed his property. The gates were professional quality, the kind used at parking garages with card readers and cameras at each station. James printed simple signs: private property, Sullivan Ranch, toll road, $15 per vehicle, credit debit only, questions. Sullivan, toll road, gmail.com. The HOA had accepted his terms after Robert Chen walked Patricia through exactly how badly positioned they were legally. They'd sent a terse letter agreeing to the arrangement and stating they accepted no liability. James didn't care about their liability acceptance. He cared about the revenue stream. The first week was chaos. Residents who'd grown accustomed to the shortcut arrived at the gate furious and confused. Some tried to turn around, discovered the long loop added 20 minutes to their commute, and came back to pay. Others sat honking until they realized James wasn't coming out to argue. The cameras captured everything. One man tried to ram the gate and succeeded only in damaging his BMW's front bumper. James sent him the repair bill plus a trespassing citation. By week 2, word had spread. If you wanted the shortcut, you paid Sullivan. No exceptions, no negotiations. The credit card readers processed transactions smoothly. James had set up a business account called Sullivan Ranch Access LLC and was meticulously tracking every payment for tax purposes. The HOA emergency meeting happened on January 19th. Patricia tried to spin the situation, claiming they were exploring legal options to remove the gates. But Robert Chen delivered the bad news. They had no legal standing. The road was on Sullivan's property, built without permission. He could charge whatever he wanted. Some residents demanded the HOA pay the tolls. Others wanted to sue Sullivan. A few demanded Patricia's resignation. The meeting dissolved into shouting. James watched a video recording of it later. Someone had live-streamed it to Facebook and felt no satisfaction, just a cold validation that arrogant people always turn on each other when consequences arrive. The real turning point came in February when the local news picked up the story. A reporter from Denver's ABC affiliate saw James's toll gates on TikTok. Someone had filmed themselves paying and posted it with angry commentary and drove out to interview him. James agreed readily. He explained the entire situation calmly: the harassment, the illegal construction, the forged permits. He showed the reporter his documentation. The story aired on February 23rd with the headline, "HOA's Illegal Road Becomes Rancher's Revenue Stream." Suddenly, James wasn't the bad guy. He was the victim who'd found a creative solution. The story went viral. National news picked it up. James did interviews with CNN and Fox News. Patricia Whitmore became the face of HOA overreach. Property values in Ridgemont Heights dropped 8% in 3 months. By April, the toll road had generated $73,000. James deposited every penny in a dedicated account. Some residents had started taking the long way rather than pay, but enough still used the shortcut that revenue remained steady. Emma asked her father if he felt guilty taking people's money. James explained he'd offered to close the road entirely and they'd chosen to keep it open. Every person who paid did so voluntarily. They could drive the extra 4 miles for free anytime they wanted. The toll wasn't punishment. It was the fair cost of using someone else's private property for convenience. The final confrontation came in June when Patricia Whitmore showed up at James's door unannounced. She looked exhausted. The HOA had held a vote and removed her as president. Her husband was furious about the negative publicity. She wanted to know if James would consider a buyout of the toll arrangement, a one-time payment to remove the gates and grant a permanent easement. James asked how much. She said $100,000. He said the gates stay. She asked what it would take. James told her the truth, nothing she could offer. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about ensuring that entitled people understood property rights weren't suggestions. His family had worked this land for 4 generations. The gates would stand as long as he owned the ranch. A permanent reminder that you can't bulldoze your way through someone's life and expect them to make it easy for you afterward. 1 year later, the Sullivan Ranch toll road had generated $214,000 in revenue. James used $50,000 to fully restore the damaged pasture and upgrade his fencing to commercial-grade steel. He put another $50,000 in a college fund for Emma. The rest went into a ranch improvement fund. The cattle operation expanded. Emma started a TikTok account documenting ranch life that gained 100,000 followers. The toll gates became a quirky local landmark. People drove out just to take photos with them. James Sullivan, the quiet civil engineer who just wanted to raise cattle and honor his family's legacy, had become a symbol of individual property rights against institutional overreach. And every morning when he drank his coffee on the porch, he could hear the distant beep of the card readers processing another payment. A $15 reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a settlement. Sometimes it comes from understanding exactly how to turn someone else's violation into your own permanent victory. The gates would stand as long as the ranch did, and the Sullivan family wasn't going anywhere. Across the country in Savannah, Georgia, retired naval architect Catherine Pierce received a letter from her neighborhood association demanding she remove the boat in her driveway within 48 hours or face daily fines. Catherine read the letter twice, set it down carefully, and pulled out her property deed, the one that explicitly included maritime storage rights from 1924, predating the neighborhood association by 60 years. She smiled the same smile she'd used when designing aircraft carrier modifications for the Pentagon and picked up the phone to call her attorney. The HOA president had made one critical mistake. He'd threatened someone who'd spent 30 years finding solutions to problems far more complex than his little power trip. But that's a story for another time.